to keep in mind when you're playing 40 line, things that you should understand. First up, you have to know your terminology. So we got TPM, which is the tetraminos per minute, so the amount of tetraminos you can place per minute. LPM is the amount of lines you clear per minute. KPS is the keys per second. DAS is the delayed auto shift, which is the amount of frames it takes for a piece to move from left to right. So right now I have this set to 20, but if you lower that number, like I typically use 4, then you'll see a drastic change in like how quickly the piece moves from left to right. You see what a big change that is? Like, DAS is a really important and fundamental part of sprint in my opinion, and I'll discuss a little more about that in a bit, but it's just something to keep in mind. Next up is IRS and IHS, which is the initial rotate system and the initial hold system. Basically, it lets you rotate or hold a piece before the next piece spawns. And it may not seem like much, but these are actually really big components to being able to play faster. If you want an example, let's just take a look at the Tetris Friends initial hold and initial rotate. If I were to lower this, all of these, then it would become a completely different game, which is why I stress the importance of these parts of Tetris. So these are the normal settings that I use. Just gonna play a bit so you guys get the idea. Now let's turn that all off, and immediately you notice a difference. The pieces are a little like, they're stuttering a bit before they actually move on to the next piece. So you can see like it actually makes a big difference to like how you play your game, how quickly you can go, things like that. Like I actually pressed hold there to try to get the T out, but it didn't work the first time, and that's what I'm talking about. If you don't have this setting on, then it won't let you hold before the initial piece spawns. Just something to keep in mind. You always want to find a game where they offer these kind of settings. Yeah, these are the settings that you should keep in mind of there to help you gauge how fast you're going, or just keep track of like what the game offers. Next up, this is actually a big part of what I feel helps people get faster. I mean, this helps you trim off the micro hesitations that you may have during a sprint that may cost you milliseconds that eventually add up to like this big amount that you could save. So one thing that you might hear people saying is like, learn the two-step finesse schema, which is right here. So there's a schema for every different piece. And what finesse is it's the most efficient way to get to any position on the matrix. So say you want to get to the left side of the matrix with the eyepiece, then this would be the most efficient way to get there. Dash to the left wall and then press hard drop. If you're confused, finesse is largely intertwined with efficiency, and in Tetris, efficiency is calculated by the amount of key presses you dedicate per tetramino. And in regards to sprints especially, what you should always be trying to do is finding any way to lower the amount of key presses, especially your keys per tetramino. So for example, like I could dash to the wall and hard drop this piece, but I could also save myself a key input and just drop it like that, and that would have a KPT of 1. Just minor things like that you have to keep in mind, and eventually you can train your brain to be able to see things like that, and that's all in practice. Moving on, the client that you use is also incredibly important. I typically use Nopomino, which is this program that you just saw, but any client with no line clear delay and DAS customizability and ARR and IRS and IHS is a good client in my opinion. It's really just based on your preference. Nopomino is the most popular option because I have no idea. I think it's just become the hallmark of Tetris games in terms of like single player modes, because it has an emulation for almost every Tetris game. But other options are Farder's Dig mod. This is something that I've been exploring recently. I personally think this is probably a better option than Nopo, because Nopomino actually has like this bug where when you place or when you lock a piece, it might move to one tile to the left or the right, which is a really big problem. It's like a run ruiner. So it's just things to keep in mind, you know, like keep your options open, and also keep in mind the limitations of that client. Oops. All right. Learn to stack efficiently and flat. So one thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to play a 40-line game, the most efficient finish would be with 100 pieces. That would be with a perfect clear. So if you look up Kuroko's 18.95 sprints, that's the most efficient use of his pieces that you can get, at least like in terms of the amount of pieces that you use. And in any 40-line game, you can always finish with 100 to 103 pieces. That's the most efficient that you can get. Your aim is to get around the 100 to 102 pieces mark. 103 is pushing it a bit, but it's still okay. Learning to stack flat and efficient. I'm actually planning on dedicating a stacking video to this section, because there's just too much to talk about with stacking and efficiency for me to place it in this video. So I'll discuss that in another video, which is what I have here, stacking methods. Next up is the piece design. One thing that I've noticed is, I think this is just purely idiosyncratic of me, but I feel like the appearance of the block plays an impact on how you do in 40 lines. Because like a lot of 40 lines is like, especially when you're trying to go your fastest, you want everything to be comfortable, you want everything to be fluid, and to do that you have to be familiar with everything that you're using. So the piece that you're using, the DAS delay, the game that you're using or the client that you're using, the DAS that you're using, you also want to get used to, like, just things like that. For example, like if I were to play sprint on this, these pieces look a little strange to me, and I actually found that I can't really perform as well, or maybe like it's just in my head, but this is something that you can test out yourself. If like the pieces aren't aesthetically pleasing to you, then you know it's probably time for a change. It's not a big deal, but it's just something to keep in mind again. Next up is keyboard and equipment. A lot of times you'll catch me talking about keyboards and the importance of having a mechanical keyboard with red switches and like just to like maximize the performance output that you could dish out. But I found that a lot of players they might not want to play with mechanical keyboards. Maybe their fingers aren't strong enough, because mechanical keyboards are harder to press occasionally than other ones. Some people prefer scissor switches. I myself am an advocate of the mechanical keyboard and Cherry MX red switches, but I've learned that you can make the best out of any situation. So just play with whatever you're comfortable with. Next up is the rotation settings. So in Tetris, there's ARS, which is Eureka rotation system, and SRS, which is super rotation system. The most commonly used one, or like the standard for modern games, is super rotation system, which is this one. This is the one that you want to use for 40 line, because just how the pieces come out, or how the pieces are oriented, apparently it's more beneficial than it would be with ARS, and it's more intuitive too, because there are more games with SRS than there are with ARS, at least that I'm aware of. If you want to do ARS, you can do it, you can use it as well, but rotation system, so this is basically what the pieces look like when they spawn for the Eureka rotation system. I'm sure most of you here are familiar with the super rotation system, but you can already see that there's a stark contrast to how it appears from the initial spawn, the ARS compared to the SRS. This is a preference thing as well. It's just something to be aware of, you know, like you have the option to play with either if you so fancy. Moving on, music, I feel, is actually a big part of Tetris. Ideally, you want something with a lot of beats per minute, like a song with a lot of beats per minute. I initially started off that way, but I've gradually moved away from that, and I just like listen to music that I enjoy now. I honestly don't think it matters too much, but you know, obviously you don't want to be playing something depressing when you're trying to break a record, right? I encourage you guys to like try this out. I'm actually curious how you guys feel about the music. It's something that's been largely debated. We don't actually know whether or not music will help, I guess. You guys can try it out for yourselves. But also keep in mind the piece sounds, whether or not the piece sounds help you or they actually hurt your 40 line. Because one thing that I've tried out that I found works is, especially with like No Pomino, like I've become accustomed to the sound set of this No Pomino, the original No Pomino 7.5. And what I do is like those little tings as I lock down the piece, I use those as a metronome for like rhythm, just keeping rhythm. And I find that it actually helps me go faster. I'll discuss this more in another video, but for now, just like try it out, you know? Find out if it works for you, what doesn't. Music or no music, maybe in-game sound works for you, maybe you play better without piece sounds. Just a lot of this stuff is dependent on the person. There's no right way to play Tetris. Keybinds. Okay, so this is a topic that I always argue with other Tetris players about, because other Tetris players, you know, like in general, most people believe that the best keybind would be one in which one hand would be dedicated to moving left and right, and the other hand would be dedicated to rotating your pieces. Which, like, you know, in some ways I can see the benefit of that. You have like equal distribution of responsibility between your hands, but I've been using the same keybind for 8 years, and I don't think it has nearly as big of an impact as people think it does. I personally think that if you're comfortable with a keybind, then that's the best keybind for you. So just play with whatever is comfortable with you. I personally use Tetris Friend's default settings, and that's worked for me so far. I encourage you to try different ones before you fully commit to Tetris, and then like just don't worry about it too much. You can change it if you want in the middle as well if you want to. All it is muscle memory, and you can always replace it with a new one if you wanted to. Moving